Good people don't smoke marijuana.
I've known Larry for a long time.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
This is the Medical Marijuana Radio Show with Larry Love. All love. I got something here for you and me. Oh yeah, it's a medical marijuana. Whoa, whoa. I got something here for you and me. Oh yeah, it's a medical marijuana. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Medical Marijuana Radio. This week we'll be speaking to Dr. Al, a New Jersey pharmacist who is totally into using cannabis as a medicine and helping people and teaching people how to use it. And we'll be with him in just a moment. But first, let me just remind you of my Clubhouse show, Late Night with Marijuana, every Friday and Saturday nights, 9 p.m. on the West Coast and midnight on the East Coast. And now, here's our interview with Dr. Al.
This is the Medical Marijuana Radio Show with Larry Love. All love.
And today we have Dr. Alan Al. He's a registered pharmacist, an industry consultant, and we're going to talk about using cannabis mindfully as well as many other things. Welcome to Medical Marijuana Radio, Dr. Allen.
Hey, Larry. Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure. I'm kind of new to Clubhouse, so just getting used to the environment and the kind of dynamics is very different because it's either I'm used to a podcast where someone's talking to me or like I'm lecturing. So never a real discussion method, but I definitely like the layout of how Clubhouse is made.
Yes, it's been great. I've met so many great people like yourself that are just into cannabis and medically and being in the pharmacy industry. The first thing I'm going to ask you is what did you learn about cannabis in pharmacy school?
So there was one course, or actually one lesson, that even mentioned cannabis, and it was like in a drugs and toxicology class. So it was still coming from the perspective of this is a controlled dangerous substance, similar to LSD and a lot of these other harder drugs, as you can say. But yeah, we never learned anything about the endocannabinoid system, therapeutic benefits, or anything of that in school. But keep in mind, I also did go to college almost like 10 plus years ago. They're just starting to develop a lot of courses that are more specialized and bringing it to light. But yeah, I definitely didn't receive any formal training on cannabis.
So when did you hear about the endocannabinoid system, and then what did you do about learning about it?
Well, you know what, like, I guess every cannabis conversation has to start with some sort of stigma and personal feelings, right? So that back in high school and college, I was actually a very staunch advocate against cannabis consumption because I remember distinctly a lot of people that I've met through my travels didn't succeed in college because of the laziness factor, the typical stoner mentality that you stereotype. So I had negative views on what cannabis was. And it wasn't until I personally tried it myself, I was like, okay, well, let's see what the fuss is about, right? So then that led me down this rabbit hole of understanding where these feelings came from, about how being a Schedule I substance changed the entire industry based on the amount of research that's available, the amount of research that can be done. And then I started learning about we have a whole network, an endocannabinoid system in our body that regulates pretty much almost every single physiological bodily movement, control, and function. And it just opened my doors to this reality like, hey, there is something here. We just don't fully understand it.
So what did you do to go get that information and to absorb it? There weren't, 10 years ago, there certainly weren't a lot of books out. I mean, there's several books out now on the endocannabinoid system. Dr. Regina Nelson has one. ECS Therapy is her name of her company, I think. So what did you do? Because there really hasn't been much out there.
Yeah, a lot of it was reading. You're right. So there have been books published, and there's more and more. The most recent one that I really enjoy is Cannabis Handbook by Dr. Dustin Sulak.
Yes.
He has a company, healer.com, and it's very useful for CBD products, but it also has a lot of value translated to THC and other cannabinoids. So that's the one I'm really focused on right now. I have a whole arsenal of books that I've combed through, as well as podcasts, listening, and going to actual seminars or those group type events where they have lectures on stage. That was a lot of where my information stemmed from.
Do you know of a Dr. Sunil Agrawal? Have you looked at his work?
Yes, I've heard his name. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe he's in Washington State. You might check that out. And then Dr. Michelle Ross, who's been on this show, she has a book out on endocannabinoids and some others as well. And Dr. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say there's also groups out there that are really doing the good work. So I'm involved with a project with Society of Cannabis Clinicians. I'm their education director for pharmacy course that we're developing. Also a board member of International Society of Cannabis Pharmacists. So it's a collective network of mainly US-based pharmacists, but they just really speak about their experiences and the state-to-state variability. So these are like peers that you kind of have to bounce ideas off of. When there's no industry norm that's accepted, the place that you have to go is to the people that are actually doing the work, right?
Right. So have you been in any clubhouse rooms with Gil Luxembourg from Israel, who helped that program get started over the last 22 years?
Yeah, he's working on some really cool stuff in Israel. Yeah. So I'm glad we connected. But yeah, I think our paths are going to align at some point. I mean, I'd be happy to go into like some of the projects I'm working on, but we have very similar interests aligned right now.
Excellent. Well, tell me about some of the things that you're personally working on. I would appreciate hearing that, whatever you can talk about.
So a little bit about my background. I'm a pharmacist by trade. I worked retail pharmacy for almost a decade in kind of small mom and pop shop settings, really getting to know the community and getting to know families and their family history. So it was a very kind of small town feel to it. I transitioned to 2018 to a medical cannabis dispensary, where I spent 2.5 years working primarily in operations. I served as vice president / clinical pharmacist. So I would say a large majority of my role there was more operational than clinical. And then this January I left, I started a consulting firm, Plants and Prescriptions, where I do one-on-one medical consulting with patients, as well as industry consultants for dispensaries that really want to keep that medical focus. I can do staff education, SOP development, inventory compliance training, and things of that nature, since it's secondhand.
Do you do that all by video, or do you physically go into the location and teach people?
I can do both. Like I don't mind traveling. Right now, I haven't had the need to, and especially given the pandemic, people are a little bit more understanding. But nothing beats that face-to-face interaction / handshake.
Yeah. Well, I've sort of been in that position years ago. About 2011. I helped open up one of the first dispensaries in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and being that I had most of the experience with cannabis, other than the 20-year-olds and the owner who never knew anything about cannabis, I had to sort of counsel. I'm guessing like maybe you do at times at a dispensary, where you have older people come in and they've never had cannabis before, but there's a new program in their state, and their doctor says, yeah, you should try this, but how would you counsel a person who's never had cannabis before and they want to use it as medicine for the first time? Let me play that with you. Okay?
Sure. So the first thing you want to do is relate it to something that they understand, right? Which is a traditional pharmacy. Everyone kind of knows how a pharmacy transaction goes, right? The doctor calls in a prescription for you, the name, the strength, the frequency, everything is listed on the bottle, so that when the pharmacist dispenses it to you, you just really have to read the directions. So pairing that with a dispensary, we all know that that's not how dispensaries operate. There's no specific dosage form, dosage recommendation, dosage type even. And so a lot of that is self-guided. So you take what they're familiar with and you kind of reverse engineer their experience, right? So instead of the pharmacist counseling on prescription medications at the counter, you have other people like your dispensary technicians that are going through products. So it's a very systematic process of, number one, understanding what you're consuming, and number two, understanding how the route of administration affects the onset of action and duration of action. And number three, the dose is something that really requires self-discovery, because even though 1 milligram, 2.5 milligrams, 5 milligrams of THC are considered microdosing, it's not a uniformly understood, like, hey, where do we start with this? If you're a 90-year-old, 90-pound woman with terminal cancer, your starting dosage is going to be very different than a 300-pound 30-year-old.
Right.
But
it's still going to be very small.
Absolutely.
Okay,
right.
and because I actually, you just described, except for the cancer part, I had to counsel a 90-year-old woman who'd never had cannabis before.
Yeah.
Okay, and of course, if they have a bad experience the first time, they're not going to come back to it. Because there is an aspect of cannabis that when you're having a uncomfortable feeling, that it's scary for a lot of people. So you have to tell them, listen, no one's ever died from this, and here's what to do if you have a bad feeling. But so as much as people, what do you say if people say, look, I want to try cannabis, but I don't want to smoke it. It's got to be bad for you to smoke anything. So how do you react to that? I have my own reaction to it as well.
Sure. So I will, if they're very staunchly against inhalation, I'm not going to fight them to that until they experience THC on its own, right? Because THC is a manufactured product when it becomes a sublingual tincture, an edible, even a vape cartridge. It's a manufactured product.
Mm-hmm.
So when you introduce someone to just THC, they're going to see what the effects are. And depending on the condition, I would most likely recommend a sublingual form, because it's a decently rapid onset and it doesn't have a long duration of action. It's very easy to dose with droppers. So instead of even using, an ml version, like a 0.5 or 0.25 ml, you just say, okay, put 3 drops under the tongue. That's something that's very easily doable and easily trackable. You wait about half an hour to an hour. If you're not feeling anything, then do another 2 to 3 drops.
That's the hard part, dude. That's the part that everybody makes a mistake with.
Right.
Okay, I have found, and I hate to contradict someone who's gone through pharmacy school, but I find I try to talk them into taking a puff of cannabis first, okay? And I cite the Harvard study of maybe 5 or 6 years ago that says cannabis actually causes lung function to increase and increases lung volume, okay? This is a 5,000 person study, and there's no evidence that it causes lung cancer. So I just think trying to titrate someone the first time with an edible, which affects you in a different way, those 3 drops, depending upon what that dosage is in the bottle, that could be, 3 milligrams, or it could be 20 milligrams, So, I mean, I think 20 milligrams of a edible type, ingesting it internally is way too much for somebody, to try the first time.
No, absolutely. And a lot of calculation, like math calculations, is difficult to explain to a person, right? So you can give them a concentration on a bottle and be like, okay, well, you need to take 1 milligram, because that's what the recommended starting dose is on a lot of chronic pain protocols. And they're going to be like, okay, what's 1 milligram? Mm-hmm. And instead of being like, it's 2 3/4 of a drop, you sort of have to estimate that. So it's not a perfect science by any means. And it doesn't get to a perfect science unless you have an edible. You know how much you're consuming, but then the pharmacokinetics of how it metabolizes in the body is different. So yes, they will experience it differently. My problem with inhalation and vaporization in itself is a great tool, a vehicle to use. However, it comes with added costs that like a dry herb vaporizer, right? We're not talking about vape pens here, because vape pen is the similar situation. It's isolated THC with added terpenes.
This is a dry herb vaporizer. You put herb in it. So
Yeah,
So go
but
ahead.
it's an upfront investment for someone that is not really sure if it's going to work for them. Obviously, smoking is the least expensive route, but then as a healthcare professional, I really don't feel comfortable advertising that as the primary form of consumption, because who knows down the line what kind of studies are going to come out. You're still inhaling something that's a burned plant material, a burned wrap material, whatever, rice paper,
Hmm.
whatever, hemp, even hemp paper too. So somewhere down the line, they will do these kinds of studies, and just putting anything in your lungs, even though the route of administration is convenient, is just not preferred as a healthcare
Right. Well, I'll tell
professional.
you what, I've been smoking it, cannabis for 53 years. 20 years from now, hopefully, I will donate my body to science and they can tear me apart and we can see how, 50, 60 years of smoking is what your lungs look like. I know that when I go to my doctor for a checkup, knock wood, my lungs are always very good. So I can tell you that much. Anyway, so yeah. So tell us about using cannabis mindfully. That
Yeah.
sounds like
So if you go onto my Instagram, I've been doing like this little mini series, and I love doing mini series because it's a lot of information to digest at once. It revolves around this concept of intentional consumption, right? And this is nothing new, but it needs to be kind of more pronounced as cannabis becomes streamlined, because when you have one product in front of you and you're using it in a medicinal use or a recreational use or even a casual use, what it boils down to is a person's intention, right? Like, obviously, we know that this THC has a potential for a lot of sedative couch lock effects, but it also has potential for creativity and mindfulness and stimulation. Like I need to get up and clean my house until it's spick and span. Like, everyone's had those moments before. But being able to craft an experience and really just target predictable responses. That's the goal everyone should be shooting for when it comes to cannabis. So taking a scientific approach to what you're consuming, it breaks down to the 5 different categories. I mean, you obviously need to know what the product is you're consuming, being able to read something with labels, with testing standards. That's like a norm, just knowing what you're consuming. As we talked about before, dosage form has a different onset of action and different duration of action. So that's definitely something to consider, especially because you don't want to have those psychoactive effects during the same time period where you need to go get stuff done, pick up your kids from school, cook dinner for the family, right? So you don't want it to impede your lifestyle. The dose is obviously very straightforward, and this is probably the most touchy subject on what is considered a dose. But then there's also this kind of spiritual component to cannabis, and that's in your setting and mental space. This is where cannabis-based medicine really differs than traditional pharmaceuticals, because the psychoactive properties of THC and other cannabinoids can have an impact on external stimuli, right? So depending on where you are and where your headspace is at, your experience with the same cannabis product can be drastically different if you're in the comfort of your own home in your
yes.
pajamas versus if you're at, a party with 200 people and there's, bright lights flashing and, a typical clubbing scene, you would
Sure.
say. And so being really intentful of what you're consuming is kind of what the message needs to get out there. Because at some point in time, there will be a true medicinal population who currently does not want to get those psychoactive effects that may benefit from other minor cannabinoids like CBG, CBDA, and other things. And to be able to confidently guide them through selection at a dispensary, I don't know if a current dispensary technician would be well suited for that, right?
Mhm.
Like, everyone's really familiar with THC, CBD for now, but we're seeing smaller pockets of minor cannabinoids come out that are really focused on entourage effect, the terpenes, and everything else that the science is starting to demonstrate. And how do you compartmentalize and package that to something that's easily digestible to consumer? That's the big question right now. THC is very easy, 1 milligram and titrate up. CBD, you can start low, go slow. There's no psychoactive effects. But then once you start combining ratios, cannabinoid ratios, terpene ratios, you can actually craft an experience that you want. And if you want to use it medicinally, that's great. Like there's certain terpene profiles, combinations that would be better for pain and sedation, right? But if you also have the recreational consumption, hey, like I want to go out and I want to paint, you know, 100-foot canvas on something. Like what am I going to consume that's going to give me that creative expression? And that's going to be a different product with a different terpene profile with a different dose. So knowing what you're consuming rather than just, hey, I'm smoking, can really tailor your experiences and kind of cultivate this meaningful relationship that you have with a meaningful, healthy relationship with the plant, so that you are getting something out of it and not just using it to get blasted to sit on your couch.
Right. So let's talk about THCA, the acid form, okay? Because I read that there's just tons of medical benefits through that, juicing the raw plant flowers and so forth. And of course, you know, you just mentioned, you know, getting high from THC. That seems to be the big worry for some people. So have you had any experience either using it or having patients use THCA, like juicing cannabis or just not decarboxylating an oil or tincture?
Well, considering we're in New Jersey and we barely have enough products in the medical market, I have not come across anyone yet. Even finding the product to be able to do that with is nearly impossible in the tri-state area.
All right, so tell me about New Jersey, since that's where you are. Obviously, they've had somewhat of a medical program. It hasn't been so great over since the beginning, and I believe you are in the midst of promulgating rules and so forth for the adult use. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure.
It's been signed, and it's been signed by the governor and so forth.
Right. So New Jersey's medical marijuana program launched in 2013, and it stayed really stagnant for a while until Governor Murphy came in and opened up the program to chronic pain and anxiety. So I'll give you, for example, when I started working in 2018, we had about less than 20,000 registered patients. And then when I left this past January, so about 2.5 years, we had a little over 100,000 patients. So think of that program expanding tremendously, but the access to supply, the number of dispensaries, those were always problems. And then the pandemic hit, and that threw everything in a whirlwind. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement with the current medical program. But if I could have the magic wand and change one thing, it would just be the testing requirements. That really is something that I think is important, because to understand what and how much you're consuming, you need to have better testing standards, to say the least.
All right. So what's wrong with the current testing? Are there not enough labs, or are they not testing for the right things?
There was a lot of red tape in getting products tested. So the turnaround time on average was, I think, about 4 to 6 weeks.
Oh,
so
my.
think of the amount of products that you would have sitting on your shelf waiting to dispense if waiting for those results to come back. When product is already short-sighted in New Jersey, there was a lot of issues around that. Also a high cost too. Each lab test cost a few $1,000s, and that's a lot for a lab or a company to absorb completely. So because of that, the testing measures were never really something that was, in an ideal world, you would do batch to batch testing, especially for flower products, right? Because you can have similar genetics. Like you can give you and I a cannabis seed or a clone, and you can give a master grower the same exact clone, and we would have two completely different plants, right? So if you test something once, 2 years ago, and you have 4 different generations, 4 different phenotypes that occur afterwards, you really don't know what's in it, as far as THC concentrations, other minor cannabinoids, and even from a safety profile of has anything changed in the growing mediums to be worried about,
Right.
so that's kind of where they got it right in the sense that they made interim rules for lab testing. So now dispensaries have the option to go to third party lab testing instead of the one that the New Jersey Department of Health and now this New Jersey CRC is regulating.
Aha. So the state was actually doing the testing, is what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's always questionable. What do they know about cannabis is what I'd like to know.
Well, they knew a lot. I mean, they had a lot of there was one head researcher, his name escapes me. I think it was Sherman. But he had the right mind and intention. But a lot of the time science and policy don't mix. And that's a very big, like, as scientists, we want objective data as much as possible and as many data points as possible too, to make a logical conclusion or reasonable assumption on things.
Sure.
Especially with things that are not we don't have evidence from large clinical trials for anything pretty much. So we need to have as many data points as possible to make the best conclusion. So there were people pushing for it, but then I don't know what happens behind the scenes, but all I know is science and policy rarely mix in a way that is good for the end consumer, to say the least.
Right. Well, the different states in our country tend to have different rules themselves. Some certain states are just afraid of people getting high, even though it's a medical program. I think maybe Georgia, if I'm not mistaken, has like a 5% cap on THC.
Yeah.
I mean that's not medical cannabis, and they make up I say this all the time. They make up these laws while they're all sitting around having a 3-martini lunch about about the psychoactivity in cannabis. So I mean it's sort of crazy. Tell me about what type of medical products are in New Jersey dispensaries right now. I mean, can you get patches? Can you get suppositories?
It's very basic. I mean, we have 2 companies making edible products, right? It's a 10 milligram gummy. Well, it's not a gummy. It's a soft lozenge.
Okay.
It's a gummy, but they have to call it soft lozenge because then it gets into that gray area of edibles, right? So they have that. They have topical MCT oil that you can rub on the skin. Not great absorption, but it serves its purpose. And then you have, your flower, your vape carts, and yeah, there was a time where Verano had RSO syringes, which was really great, but they sold out instantaneously, and then they never came back.
That's the medicine. That is the medicine. That is the medicine. I'll repeat it. That is the medicine right there. Okay, and there's people with cancer that need that medicine. Okay,
Right.
they tinctures aren't strong enough for them to take, and there are studies that say THC causes cancer cells to commit suicide, to eat themselves. Okay, I think the main one was out of Spain, possibly by a young lady. So it's to have call a program medical and not have medical products is a sin. Have you ever worked with a person that has cancer and advise them on what to take to try to beat that thing?
It was a difficult conversation, especially because actually tinctures were newer or newly introduced over the last year. And so before that, we were giving them recipes for, we encourage people to learn more about developing their own recipes, but we would guide them along using machines like the Magical Butter machine or the Ardent Lift to decarb their products.
Great products.
Yeah, it's a great product, but at the same time, it's a lot more legwork that you have to do to get there. And then what do you have at the end of the day? You have a product that you created, but you have no idea, again, what's in it.
Right.
And that's a big hesitation. So even if you're using raw flour, you're using it in like a rosin press or something, you don't know what the end material has and what you're consuming, right? So that conversation became really difficult. And so we tried to avoid it as much as possible. But the Green Dragon tincture, where you literally just dissolve cannabis flower in high proof alcohol and use that as a tincture. That was very popular.
Yeah, but it burns terribly.
It
It's
does.
very unacceptable for someone who's going through that kind of sickness to have to take that burn in your mouth of Everclear or whatever that alcohol is. So actually evaporating that off, if the product is already decarbed, you can evaporate that off and be left with the oil.
Exactly.
Okay, and that would be some really good medicine. But if you're buying, I don't, what does it cost for a gram of flour in Jersey?
So for an eighth, it was about $60.
Is that out the door, or is that what?
Yeah.
And what kind of taxes are medical patients paying there?
So it originally started with the state tax of 6.625. With Jay Koenig's law, it decreased to 4%, and then this past July, I think it's 2%, and it's supposed to go down to 0 once the adult use program is full-fledged.
Right, because you go to CVS and Walgreens, you're not paying taxes on that medicine, are you?
Yeah, so to your point, like, you're also not going to CVS and Walgreens picking up your medicine, like, all right, well, you got to break open all these capsules, soak in some Everclear, and then, figure out what your dose is. Like that's just the reality of the situation. When you don't have products available, that's the situation they come across. Can you imagine you being a patient being instructed how to like make this concoction to call it medicine on your own?
I've actually done that, so I understand that totally. I've done that. I've done the extraction with ethanol, freezing the bud, freezing the ethanol, shaking it, and then pouring it through filters. I've done that whole thing and decarbing it. You just mentioned capsules. So are there capsules available in New Jersey of some kind? No, there
It's
aren't.
just lozenges, right?
Okay. No,
So there's sublingual lozenges. They dissolve under the tongue very, very slowly, not very effectively either, but it's something,
So-
like it.
Is it legal for the licensed, what do they call them there? Dispensaries or
Processors. So right now
processors?
they're vertically integrated licenses, so they can cultivate, process, dispense.
Can they make
under-
capsules? Can they make capsules if they want to? Is it legal to
Um,
make a 20 milligram capsule of THC oil?
It wasn't written into the original regulations because I think they wanted to avoid that discrepancy between becoming a pharmaceutical item that would be under the watch of an FDA, right? Like having a tablet or capsule. That's actually why I'm not sure if you might know this, but Amazon used to sell capsule filling machines. Like you could buy a machine to fill capsules on Amazon, but now they're all gone.
Really? I mean, because I've bought capsules from Amazon. Okay.
Yeah,
I
physical,
bought those
right.
the physical cap, and I bought those little trays that have the holes in them, and you put all the holes in them, and then you do that. But they're not even carrying those anymore.
No, and I think
But
it's
but
because
at the
they got a
same
lot of-
time, I'm sorry to interrupt, but at the same time, I don't believe they're no longer testing people for cannabis.
right.
Right? They're
I don't
they're
know
employed.
if one
They're
has to
employees.
do with the other, but yeah.
Well, the psyche does. I mean, if you're no longer testing your employees for cannabis because it's acceptable, then why isn't it acceptable to sell non-cannabis product, just something that fills up capsule? I mean, some people make capsules out of other herbs that aren't cannabis, so I find that not a great thing. So, so in your studies over the last X amount of years, when you got interested in cannabis, what was your biggest surprise? That's something that surprised you.
Something that surprised me was the amount of social justice issues that ties into the conversation. Because if you look back at the history of like how and why cannabis became a Schedule I substance, a lot of it is rooted in racism and kind of sensationalism of Black and brown communities. And myself being Asian, I'm considered a minority, but my specific minority group has not been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, right? So meeting and encountering a lot of these people, they have such rich histories and such passionate stories about their why. Like when people ask you, what's your why? Like my story is never comparable to the ones that, like, my father was locked up in prison for selling weed. And his parents were locked up for selling weed. Like I never had those stories. So it doesn't hit as personally for me. And that's one thing I really had to adjust to, because I want to be supportive of as many generation, as much generational wealth as possible down the line. But as a scientist, as a clinician, like my objectives don't really intertwine, right? Like I want what's best for my patient. That should be my priority always. But having to understand the mentality of being sensitive to these cases, that's a major adjustment that I had to have when entering and working in this space that's still currently very strong. Like you see a lot of social equity measures that are doing great things around the country, but then you also see some that are not succeeding that well in the country, like the recent Illinois lottery system for licenses. That was crazy. But that's
they weren't the first ones to do that kind of stuff. I mean, even Florida is the most egregious state when awarding licenses to people. Originally, they would only give them to people who already had a nursery license and were growing like oranges or bushes or something. They had no experience with cannabis at all. So it's like the lawmakers just do silly things, and Florida obviously has been a big problem all along.
And the summary of the conversation is that policy influences everything that we do. And I am not one that likes to dabble in politics at all. But because of working in this industry, I've had to really follow closely along to see who represents who, what the impact is on the policy of what my patient will be experiencing, because that has direct ties somewhere down the chain, right? But my kind of goal right now is, how do I provide the best patient care and education to new and upcoming businesses that reflects the current policies that are in place? But if we go through a federal descheduling or rescheduling, then you throw that all out the window, because it's a whole different paradigm that we're going to have to work with. But either way, I'm prepared to kind of pivot, because like I can go the pharmacy route, right? Like Plants and Prescriptions is the company that I started with the intention of bridging those two worlds, or as an industry consultant. So depending on what the future holds for cannabis, we just always have to be ready.
Right. Well, in legalizing for medical cannabis over the last 20 years in different states, they don't use the word prescription. They use the word recommendation, because of the conflict between the doctors and DEA licenses and so forth. So they don't call it. But obviously, if it gets dropped off the schedule or lowered, it's a whole different game. But so where do you think it should be?
I think my personal take is that it should be descheduled. Rescheduling is going to cause a whole host of problems with access, because if you turn it into a Schedule 2 to 5 and force people to go to a pharmacy, like you can't go back and restrict access to people that have it already, right? Like we have a whole industry developed in California, Colorado, Washington, and if it gets descheduled, or I'm sorry, rescheduled to Class 2 to 5, where you need like a pharmacy license, that's just another barrier to access.
Right, and that would kill home grow.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, look, this plant is an amazing plant. I mean, I find out new stuff every day about it, and talking to experts and new studies coming out and so forth. But it's so not harmful in so many ways that we should be allowed to grow it. So I just feel that states that legalize and don't allow people to grow at home and are going to still criminalize growing, that's not a legalization program, okay? Because and then the other thing is, when states are legalizing for adult use, we have to have some kind of a program in play to keep the medical cannabis dispensaries and licenses active. They've been disappearing in other states. Here in New Mexico, we just June 29th, our adult use law went into effect. However, no one's gotten licenses yet. They're still writing the laws and so forth. But they have a micro license that's available for medical people that want to come into the medical industry here in New Mexico. They're going to have like half the fees, lower costs. They want to motivate people to come in medically. But I find in this state and other states that the 90-something% of the licensed medical providers have been treading water waiting for rec. And you can tell by the way their dispensaries are set up and what kind of products they carry, and finding patches and capsules and capsules and all that stuff has just gotten a lot harder.
Yeah.
And so what do you think we should do about it? I mean, it shouldn't be given to pharmaceutical companies.
That's funny you should ask. So I've been working with, it's a nonprofit called Garden State Pharmacy Owners, the GSPO. It's a network that supports the 500 plus independent pharmacies that are located in New Jersey. So currently their active, roster has, I think, 250 pharmacies on board. But they actually have been lobbying for a special class of licenses. We had a presentation with the New Jersey Cannabis Regulatory Commission last week about a special class of licenses for pharmacies to also dispense medical cannabis. I mean, if you think about it logistically, it makes a lot of sense. They have brick and mortar stores, they have a clinician on site, they have advanced inventory controls, and they already have involvement with the communities. So it'd be a natural fit. Like you get one counter to pick up your prescription meds and you get another counter to pick up your medical cannabis. And the segue to that conversation is, harm reduction. That's what our entire industry is based upon. Yes, cannabis is safe. But there are still consequences if you take too much, right? So being able to individualize therapies and kind of work with the patient side by side in a more structured capacity than a dispensary agent would be.
All right. With the amount of time we have left, which is about 5 minutes or so, how do you see the future of pharmacological and big pharma using cannabis to make products in the future?
I think it's going to have to exist in both worlds. Given the way that CBD is now, it's available as Epidiolex, an anti-seizure medication that requires a prescription from a physician. But it's also CBD that's available at your gas station. The molecule itself is the same. It comes from the same plant. So why are they charging, $1,400 for a bottle of it versus, $10 at the gas station, right? And that is the big question. And honestly, I don't know. I want to see larger clinical studies of minor cannabinoids and even THC being used as a therapeutic ingredient, but I don't want to see that cause restricted access to the people, because I believe it does belong to the people that have been growing this for centuries, the people that have cultivated and built their entire lives around this. Like I'm not supportive of taking that away from them.
Right.
So I think it's going to have to exist as two different types of mediums, whether it be like, for example, you can get Motrin as a prescription strength Motrin, 600 milligrams, 800 milligrams, or you can get it over the counter as 200 milligrams, right? And even that model doesn't really work with cannabis, considering it's an individualized threshold on how much you need. But some sort of structure where you would call it pharmaceutical grade, whether it be coming from a CGMP manufactured facility, if you can get it reimbursed by third party. Those would be all qualifying factors of what a prescription cannabis product would encompass.
Right. So what's your experience with Marinol and the other synthetics that are actually legal?
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple of patients on Marinol, and they complained about it because it helped stimulate their appetite very briefly, but it came with a host of side effects. Like, so at the end of the day, it's the same kind of molecule, but when you don't have the entourage effect, when you don't have who knows, like the synthesized cannabinoids are always going to present differently. Like we barely know how much our current endocannabinoids and phytocannabinoids present in the body. So translating that to an artificial synthetic cannabinoid, that's kind of like a jumping 3 steps ahead.
Right. So where do you see yourself in this industry in the next couple of years? What would you like to be doing?
Well, I do plan on applying for a retail license, a class 5 retail license, and I really want to bridge that gap. If I can't have a pharmacy / dispensary side by side, I definitely want to maintain a more medical focus as far as, active lifestyle. So be able to successfully incorporate cannabis in for a natural lifestyle, so a casual lifestyle. So casual consumption, and then if you want something more on the medical focus, we would have the staff to be able to guide you with that. So hiring, RNs, licensed social workers, people that have a little bit more training as far to how to properly approach a patient and use objective kind of measurements to give them help.
Sure.
Versus the current, standard.
Sure. Well, I think New Jersey is lucky to have you, and if you get to do what you want to do, they're going to be extremely lucky. How can people get a hold of you, Dr. Al?
Yeah, so if you want to come find me on Instagram, I'm at Plants and Prescriptions. My website, plantsandprescriptions.com. LinkedIn, I kind of sign up for every single social media account, so you could probably find me somewhere. But Plants and Prescriptions, that's the name of the game.
And of course, you frequent Clubhouse in great conversations, and that's where I found you. And I'm so happy that we had this time today to educate our audience. And I thank you for your passion for this plant and being in the medical industry. I double thank you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite, Larry. This has been awesome. My
pleasure. We'll be right back after this. Thank you so much.
This is the Medical Marijuana Radio Show with Larry Love.
I want to thank Dr. Al. Thank you very much. This was a great interview. Also want to thank my 2 radio mentors, both with the initials HS. Thank you for your inspiration. Don't forget my Friday and Saturday night show, midnight on the East Coast and 9 p.m. on the West Coast. Late Night with Marijuana. Hang, smoke, and talk. Peace and love, everybody. Peace and love. We'll be back next week.
Oh, yeah. It's a medical marijuana. Whoa.